The Pacific in the summer of 1945 was a graveyard of ambitions. The sea that once glittered with imperial dreams had turned into a vast theater of exhaustion. Across islands scarred by fire and steel, the war had been won and lost 1,000 times before the final act was written. From Saipan to Okinawa, the arc of American power had bent toward inevitable victory, yet beneath the confidence of triumph lay a fear so profound it reshaped the ending of the war itself. For the United States, the path to Tokyo was not a line of conquest, but a climb into uncertainty. Each step closer to Japan revealed a paradox. The more complete their dominance, the greater their dread of what awaited them on the home islands. Intelligence officers pored over intercepted communications, aerial photographs, and testimony from prisoners of war. They found a nation that was not preparing to surrender, but to die. By July, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had before them the plans for Operation Downfall, a two-stage invasion of Japan. The first, Operation Olympic, would seize Kyushu. The second, Operation Coronet, would follow with a massive landing near Tokyo itself. Together, these would demand a mobilization greater than any in history. More than 5 million American servicemen were being prepared. Yet the ghosts of Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa lingered in every calculation. Each of those names carried with it the arithmetic of horror, thousands dead for each mile gained, hundreds of ships scarred or sunk by suicide aircraft. If such resistance was possible on isolated islands, what would the defense of the Japanese homeland bring? The U.S. Army's operations planners, under General Marshall, worked through the problem with mathematical detachment. Estimates ranged from 250,000 to 1 million American casualties. Some figures suggested the total dead might surpass all U.S. losses in the entire war. The Navy spoke of mass kamikaze attacks, hundreds or even thousands of aircraft launched in waves from hidden airfields. The Army Air Forces warned of poison gas, of biological agents, of a populace armed with bamboo spears if rifles ran short. Even the most optimistic models could not escape a grim truth. Victory might cost more lives than defeat. Across the Pacific, in a country reduced to ruins, the Japanese High Command had reached the same conclusion from the opposite side of despair. Tokyo lay half-burned, Osaka shattered, Nagoya flattened by incendiaries. The once proud Imperial Navy was a shell of its former self, and the skies belonged to American bombers. Yet surrender was a word too heavy to utter. To yield would mean the collapse of everything: emperor, empire, honor. To resist was ruin, but ruin with dignity. In the darkened chambers of the Imperial General Headquarters, officers traced the invasion routes on fading maps. They named their last plan Ketsu-Go, the decisive operation. Its purpose was simple and suicidal: to repel the American landings through total national sacrifice. 6,000 aircraft were hidden in forest clearings and mountain tunnels. The Home Guard, numbering millions of men and women, trained with crude weapons. School children dug trenches and prepared to meet soldiers with explosives strapped to their bodies. The nation had turned itself into a fortress without walls. For the Americans, this vision, gleaned from intelligence reports and captured documents, was not propaganda, but a mirror of their own memories. At Okinawa, the enemy had fought not for victory, but for annihilation. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers died there, most refusing to surrender, and nearly as many civilians perished in fire and chaos. Commanders had watched the pattern repeat on every island. The closer they came to Japan, the more desperate the defense became. President Truman, newly thrust into office after Roosevelt's death, carried these fears in the secret meetings of the spring and summer. His advisers presented him with maps, charts, and tables of probabilities. Every number concealed a story, a name that would never return home. The president's mind turned not to strategy, but to consequence. How could he explain to the mothers of America that victory required the lives of 500,000 sons? Yet the machinery of invasion moved forward. Ships were gathered, supplies amassed, divisions trained. The war in Europe had ended, freeing men and material for the final blow. In Hawaii, General MacArthur rehearsed the conquest of Kyushu. In the Marianas, the bombers of Curtis LeMay continued to burn the cities of Japan into cinders. But behind the precision of these preparations was hesitation. It was not only the enemy that terrified American planners, but the unknown shape of peace that would follow such destruction. The island of Okinawa had become a warning carved into the Pacific. There, civilians had leaped from cliffs to avoid capture, mothers had killed their children rather than surrender, and American soldiers had discovered the terrible intimacy of a war without mercy. The U.S. military psychologists who studied the aftermath concluded that such fanaticism was not an exception. It was policy. Japan's government had instructed its citizens that to die for the emperor was glory, to live in defeat was shame. Thus, when American analysts described their fears before the invasion, they spoke less of numbers than of will. How does one conquer a nation that refuses to live? How does one occupy a culture that would rather vanish than submit? By August 1945, these questions hung over every conference room in Washington, every airfield in the Pacific. The storm of war was nearly spent, yet its end seemed poised to demand one final cataclysm. The summer of 1945 unfolded beneath a sky filled with smoke and questions. Japan was already defeated in every practical sense, but the shape of its surrender or its destruction remained uncertain. In Washington, military planners wrestled with arithmetic and morality. In Tokyo, men debated whether to die together or die alone. For the Americans, Operation Downfall had become an engineering of inevitability. The war had been fought island by island, each one a grim rehearsal for the next, and now the ultimate stage lay before them. The operation was divided into two phases: Olympic, the assault on southern Kyushu, scheduled for November 1945, and Coronet, the invasion of the Kanto Plain in the spring of 1946. Together, they would open the heart of Japan like a wound. The U.S. Navy projected a fleet larger than any ever assembled, thousands of ships bearing men, tanks, and supplies, enough to feed and arm millions. Behind every figure was a hidden dread. They would be landing against an enemy that knew the sea approaches better than any map could reveal. Reconnaissance photographs showed airfields carved into mountain valleys, artillery emplacements disguised among rice paddies, and networks of tunnels that seemed to breathe defiance. Admiral William Leahy, Truman's chief of staff, examined the invasion plans with the detachment of a man who had lived too long with death. He warned that Japan's defense would not resemble Germany's collapse. The Germans had surrendered to save what remained of their cities. The Japanese would not. The only surrender possible, he wrote, might come after complete extermination. In Tokyo, the emperor's ministers read the same conclusion in reverse. The destruction of the Japanese nation, they feared, was not only possible, but imminent. Cities burned each night. Rice harvests dwindled. Disease spread through the ruins. The once vast empire had shrunk to the 4 home islands and a scattering of garrisons starving in isolation. Yet to yield was unthinkable. The army still possessed 2 million men within Japan itself, and the people were being mobilized under the doctrine of Ketsu-Go decisive battle. Civilians were drawn into the plan as if into a collective suicide pact. The Patriotic Citizens Fighting Corps, numbering over 28 million men and women, was formed from students, farmers, and factory workers, Their weapons were largely symbolic: bamboo spears, old rifles, and improvised explosives. Propaganda leaflets instructed families how to attack invading soldiers, how to use kitchen knives as bayonets, how to die before capture. For the Americans reading intercepted communications, this was both chilling and clarifying. They understood now that the Japanese government was not negotiating peace, but preparing for apocalypse. Reports from Okinawa confirmed that civilians had followed orders to destroy themselves rather than surrender. American officers feared that the same pattern, multiplied across Japan's densely populated islands, could result in millions of civilian deaths. Military planners began to speak in abstractions: attrition rates, civilian resistance factors. But behind the language was the recognition of something far older: that wars do not end when armies break, but when nations lose the will to continue. And Japan's will had been redefined into martyrdom. In the ruins of Tokyo, under the shadow of the burned imperial palace, Prime Minister Suzuki's cabinet debated the meaning of endurance. Some ministers believed a negotiated peace might yet preserve the throne. Others demanded a final battle that would force America to offer honorable terms. None dared contradict the army's insistence that surrender would dissolve the kokutai, the national essence, the sacred bond between emperor and people. Across the Pacific, American leaders studied these psychological reports with disbelief. How could a government already destroyed by fire refuse to recognize defeat? The Office of Strategic Services warned that Japan might prolong resistance through guerrilla warfare for years, even after losing its major cities. General Marshall summarized the dilemma simply: to win, the United States might have to kill every soldier, every armed civilian, every fragment of resistance that stood between the beaches and the emperor. The moral weight of that vision began to press upon the policymakers in Washington. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, an austere man of conscience, feared that the invasion would bring about the destruction of the Japanese people. Yet he also knew that the longer the war continued, the greater the suffering from air raids and starvation. Each week of indecision cost tens of thousands of lives in bombed-out cities. In the skies over Japan, General Curtis LeMay's B-29s continued their relentless campaign. They no longer targeted factories, but entire districts, wooden cities designed to burn. Tokyo, Nagoya, Kobe, Osaka, each became a furnace. LeMay calculated that destroying urban centers would collapse morale, but instead it seemed to confirm Japan's fatalism. Fire did not breed surrender, it bred silence. Meanwhile, in the laboratories of New Mexico, another kind of fire was being prepared, the one that would change not only the course of the war, but the moral vocabulary of mankind. The Manhattan Project had reached its final stage. In July, at Alamogordo, the first atomic explosion illuminated the desert. Witnesses described it as light beyond the scale of the sun, a radiance that seemed to erase the boundary between creation and destruction. When word of the success reached Washington, it entered the calculus of fear that surrounded Operation Downfall. The atomic bomb was not yet an inevitability. It was an option born of dread. The weapon offered an end to invasion, but also an entry into unknown moral territory. Could civilization preserve itself if such power were unleashed? President Truman faced this question amid competing urgencies. The Soviet Union, preparing to join the war against Japan as promised at Yalta, was massing forces in the Far East. American strategists feared that if the invasion dragged on, the Soviets would occupy Hokkaido or northern Honshu, dividing Japan as Germany had been divided. The atomic bomb, therefore, was not only a weapon, but a message to Japan, to the Soviets, to history itself, that the United States alone would decide how this war would end. Still, beneath the rhetoric of command lay a simpler, quieter terror. Letters from the front reached Washington filled with the voices of men who had survived Iwo Jima and Okinawa. They spoke of friends turned to ash by mortar fire, of caves filled with corpses, of enemies who refused mercy. "If we have to take Japan," one Marine wrote, "none of us will come back." These words echoed through the halls of power more forcefully than any report or statistic. In Tokyo, the Japanese populace lived under the rhythm of air raid sirens and silence. Each morning they cleared rubble. Each night they waited for the bombers. Newspapers printed fantasies of victory, while ration cards shrank to nothing. Yet among the ruins there remained a quiet faith that somehow the emperor would deliver them from annihilation. The contradiction defined the last months of the war. A people simultaneously resigned to death and clinging to hope. When the Potsdam Declaration was issued in late July, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender, it was met in Tokyo with confusion. The foreign minister sought compromise. The military demanded rejection. The government chose mokusatsu to treat it with silent contempt. To the Americans, this silence was defiance. To many Japanese, it was paralysis. Between the two sides, words failed, and only catastrophe remained. The plans for invasion continued to evolve. The date for Operation Olympic was set. Training intensified. Ammunition and blood plasma stockpiles filled warehouses on Saipan and Guam. Graves registration units were expanded in anticipation. It was a bureaucracy of doom and administration of death awaiting orders. Yet, even as these preparations solidified, a question lingered in every heart that had witnessed the Pacific Campaign. How much destruction is enough to end destruction itself? By the beginning of August 1945, every path seemed to lead to ruin. The American invasion was scheduled, the Japanese defense already consecrated to death, and between them stretched a silence filled with calculation. What remained was the choice of how history would remember mercy. President Truman carried the war in his briefcase. In it lay cables from the Pacific, minutes of staff meetings, and a single sheet describing the effects of a weapon whose full meaning no one yet understood. The atomic bomb promised to end the war before a single American boot touched Japanese soil, but at a cost impossible to measure. The War Department presented the matter not as morality, but as arithmetic. Operation Olympic was predicted to claim hundreds of thousands of Allied lives, perhaps millions of Japanese. The bomb, they argued, might compel surrender in days. Stimson, weary and grave, told Truman that using it could spare civilization the test of mutual slaughter. Yet he also understood that a new threshold was being crossed, the deliberate destruction of a city by a single device. In the Pacific, the men who would have led the invasion waited for orders that never came. General MacArthur's staff rehearsed landings on the beaches of Kyushu, measuring tides and terrain, while naval commanders plotted routes through mined waters. Hospitals on Guam expanded their wards, priests prepared burial rites. Every logistic unit functioned with a precision born of dread. American intelligence painted a portrait of a nation on the brink, yet unbroken. Intercepted communications revealed no move toward surrender. Instead, Japan strengthened its resolve. The Imperial Army drilled even as supplies vanished. The Home Guard collected pitchforks and bayonets. The Emperor remained a spectral presence, distant and revered, his will interpreted through a fog of bureaucracy and devotion. In the burned shell of Tokyo, government officials debated the impossible. Some pleaded to accept the Potsdam terms if the imperial institution could be preserved. The army's leaders countered that any compromise would betray the souls of the dead. To yield was to erase the sacrifices made on Saipan, Leyte, and Okinawa. Between these factions stood the emperor himself, silent, watching the empire die around him. The ordinary Japanese citizen saw little of these deliberations. They saw only the blackened horizon each morning and the thin lines of people waiting for rice that never came. Children gathered shrapnel as if collecting insects. Mothers carried water through the ruins. Rumors whispered that the Americans would land soon, that the Soviets were preparing to invade from the north, that death would come by sea or sky. On August 6th, the morning began like all others, clear, heavy with heat. Over Hiroshima, sirens sounded briefly and fell silent. A single aircraft crossed the sky, too small to warrant alarm. At 8:15 a.m., the world changed. Light replaced shadow. A city dissolved into flame and wind. Those who looked up saw nothing after that moment. Those who survived found themselves wandering through an absence. The shape of buildings burned into walls, the silence of voices that would never speak again. News of Hiroshima reached Washington hours later. The descriptions were fragmentary. Entire city destroyed. No response from defenders. Truman announced to the nation that a new weapon had been unleashed, a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. Behind the triumphal tone lay uncertainty. No one could say whether Japan would surrender or endure. In Tokyo, the cabinet met in disbelief. Reports from Hiroshima were at first dismissed as exaggeration, perhaps a new incendiary raid. When photographs arrived showing a city flattened in an instant, comprehension failed. The military insisted that even this could not justify surrender. The scientists warned that more bombs might follow. On August 8th, as they argued, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. In Manchuria, tanks poured across the border, crushing the Kwantung Army that once symbolized Japanese might. Within 48 hours, the empire's last hope of mediation vanished. The encirclement was complete. Atomic fire from the south, the Red Army from the north, hunger from within. The following day, Nagasaki burned. For the Americans, the decision to drop the second bomb was both strategic and psychological. Military planners feared that a single strike might be interpreted as a fluke. Two would demonstrate inevitability. Yet within the councils of government, doubt deepened. Some scientists urged a demonstration on an uninhabited island. Others warned that only total shock could break the deadlock of Ketsu-Go. Truman, exhausted, left the details to his commanders. By the time he realized Nagasaki had been destroyed, the bomb had already fallen. The Japanese government teetered on collapse. Ministers shouted in the cabinet room, generals threatened coups, diplomats begged for terms. Amid the chaos, Emperor Hirohito spoke for the first time in his reign. He did not command, he pleaded. The war, he said, must end to save the people from further sacrifice. His voice, recorded and broadcast days later, carried across a nation accustomed to silence. The people who heard it knelt before their radios. Some wept, others could not understand. To surrender was to unmake everything they had been taught to live when death had been sanctified. In some garrisons, soldiers refused the order, choosing suicide over disgrace. On Saipan and in China, officers carried out last executions and bowed to the rising sun one final time. In Washington, relief was tempered by unease. Victory had come not through the invasion of Japan, but through the annihilation of cities. The fear that had haunted American planners, the fear of millions of dead in a ground war, had been averted, but replaced by a new fear. That the means of ending war had itself become the greatest threat to humanity. The aftermath revealed what numbers could not convey. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, physicians tended to wounds that had no precedent. skin peeled away like paper, shadows of bodies were burned into stone. The survivors wandered through landscapes of glass and ash, carrying within them the invisible legacy of radiation. American observers who entered the cities later described them as cities without sound. The moral reckoning began even before the occupation. Some officers felt vindicated. The bombs had ended the war, saving countless lives. Others could not escape the images of what had been done. Stimson wrote in his diary that mankind had been given the knowledge of its own destruction. The president, hailed as the man who ended the war, slept poorly. He spoke often of the invasion that never came, as if haunted by the ghosts of men who had not died. For the Japanese, surrender did not bring peace, but revelation. The emperor's broadcast shattered the illusion of his divinity. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were homeless. The army disbanded under foreign occupation. Yet amid despair, there was also a strange relief. The war was over. The dying had stopped. Teachers who had preached sacrifice now taught humility. Parents who had hidden knives welcomed American food rations. The transformation of Japan began not in policy, but in exhaustion. In the months that followed, American occupation forces landed on beaches that had been mapped for invasion. They found not resistance, but silence. The fields once marked for battle were filled instead with refugees. Caves stocked with explosives became shelters for the homeless. The soldiers who expected ambushes were greeted by children offering flowers. The fears that had shaped every plan for Operation Downfall proved both true and irrelevant. Japan had indeed prepared to fight to the last, but there would be no last battle. The weapon of fear itself, the atomic bomb, had undone the logic of total war. The Americans entered a country ready for death and found one searching for survival. Yet the memory of what might have been lingered in every report, every photograph of Hiroshima. Had the invasion proceeded, the casualty estimates might have been surpassed, perhaps doubled. Civilians armed with bamboo spears might have charged tanks. Entire towns might have burned in collective suicide. In the narrow avoidance of that nightmare, many saw justification. Others saw only the dawn of a darker age. The Pacific War had begun with surprise and arrogance and ended with calculation and dread. What the United States feared before invading Japan was not defeat, but victory measured in corpses, victory that might consume the very ideals for which it fought. The bomb ended that fear by transforming it into something perpetual, the knowledge that humanity now possessed the power to end itself. The soldiers returned home. The planners archived their maps. The graves they had prepared on Saipan remained empty. But across the decades, in the silence after the explosions, the question endures: if fear saved the world from one catastrophe, what will save it from the next? The war ended not with a final battle, but with an announcement carried through the static of damaged radios. Across Japan, on August 15, 1945, a voice both distant and intimate spoke to a people who had never heard it before. The emperor's tones, thin and formal, drifted through shattered windows and into fields where farmers stopped their labor to listen. He spoke of enduring the unendurable. The words fell like ash. Silence followed, a silence so deep that for the first time in years the sky above Japan held no sound of engines. In Washington and Honolulu, the reaction was relief, muted by fatigue. Victory had come without the storm of blood everyone had predicted, yet it felt unfinished, uneasy. The generals who had drawn up Operation Downfall folded their maps away. The men who had trained for invasion watched transports divert from battle to occupation duty. Newspapers proclaimed peace, but the word felt foreign, almost fragile, as though it might dissolve under too much light. When American troops finally landed, they did so with weapons ready, expecting ambush. Instead, they found order, resignation, and quiet curiosity. Civilians bowed as columns of soldiers moved through the ruins. Children followed them, wide-eyed, whispering English phrases learned from leaflets. The Americans had feared fanatic resistance. What they encountered was exhaustion deeper than hatred. Tokyo's ruins stretched for miles, charred foundations where homes once stood, steel twisted into sculptures of defeat. Yet amid the destruction, a strange industry began. Women cleared rubble to open roads. Former soldiers dismantled their own barracks for lumber. The occupying authorities, led by General MacArthur, established headquarters in the Daiichi building across from the Imperial Palace. From that vantage, the conqueror watched the ancient court bow to a new order built on paperwork and promises. MacArthur understood that the real challenge was not the military occupation of Japan, but the occupation of its spirit. His staff called it democratization, but in practice it was an effort to replace despair with purpose. Censorship was lifted, food distributed, land reform initiated. The emperor renounced his divinity. Each decree unmade a portion of the ideology that had once demanded national death. For the American public, photographs of the atomic ruins arrived slowly, censored and ambiguous. At first, the bomb was celebrated as the weapon that saved lives. Later, as images of charred bodies and melted shadows circulated, triumph gave way to disquiet. Scientists who had built the bomb now warned of its meaning. Newspapers printed editorials asking whether civilization had crossed an invisible line. In the corridors of government, officials spoke of controlling the new power, even as laboratories planned the next generation of weapons. In Japan, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the hibakusha, became living testaments to what war had become. They carried scars that did not heal, sicknesses that had no name. For years they were shunned, reminders of shame and fear. Yet their presence also marked the beginning of a different kind of understanding, that survival itself could be resistance. The reconstruction of Japan was built upon their endurance, on the belief that life could be rebuilt from ashes. American soldiers who walked through the ruins recorded scenes that haunted them more than combat. They found bicycles fused to pavement, wristwatches stopped at 8:15, and the outlines of families burned into walls. Some wept. Others hardened themselves with the thought that this horror had prevented another. They wrote home that they had seen the price of the invasion that never came. The political reconstruction advanced with deliberate symbolism. A new constitution, drafted under American supervision, renounced war forever. The clause was as much confession as aspiration. The same nation that had once prepared for glorious extinction now swore never again to wage aggression. Factories that had produced weapons turned to radios and sewing machines. School books rewrote the past in cautious tones. The transformation was neither sudden nor painless, but it was complete enough that within a decade Japan would be known more for its industry than its armies. In the United States, the narrative of victory hardened into orthodoxy. The invasion that never happened became the measure of the bomb's necessity. Historians argued numbers, how many would have died, how many were saved. But behind the statistics remained the older fear that had shaped every decision, the fear of endless death, of fighting a nation that would rather vanish than yield. The atomic bomb ended that fear by proving that there existed something even greater to dread. The generals retired, the scientists aged, and the world entered the uneasy peace called the Cold War. The lesson of Japan was studied in every staff college and diplomatic cable, that total war could no longer be fought without risking total extinction. The same calculation that spared Japan from invasion now governed the planet. Fear had become the universal language of survival. In Japan's countryside, life returned slowly. Farmers planted rice where trenches had been dug for defense. Children grew up among the relics of a war they barely remembered, helmets rusting in ditches, slogans fading from walls. Yet each year, on August 6th and 9th, the cities paused to remember. Bells rang. Paper lanterns floated down rivers carrying names of the dead. The ceremonies were quiet, more sorrow than accusation. They did not speak of blame, only of memory. American veterans visiting decades later often stood among those mourners. Some whispered apologies, others explanations. Most remained silent, watching the light of the lanterns drift away like fragments of an unfinished prayer. In that silence, the fears of 1945 seemed to echo faintly, the dread of invasion, of annihilation, of the unknown face of peace. The occupation years transformed both nations in ways neither had intended. For Americans, Japan became proof that war could create democracy. For the Japanese, America became proof that mercy could arise from devastation. Yet beneath the successes of Reconstruction ran a deeper current, the shared recognition that modern power had outgrown human comprehension. What had been feared in 1945, the loss of life, the collapse of nations, was now joined by a new terror, the possibility of extinction without battle. By the 1950s, Japan's cities glittered with neon and industry. The scars of war were hidden beneath concrete, though never erased. Hiroshima rebuilt itself around peace memorials, Nagasaki around churches that blended faiths once thought incompatible. The emperor appeared in public, no longer a god, but a symbol of endurance. Children studied English, sang American songs, dreamed of prosperity. The transformation was so complete that many forgot how close the world had come to an ending without precedent. Yet historians continued to unearth the documents of Operation Downfall, maps of beaches that were never stained with blood, casualty estimates scrawled in the margins, letters from officers who expected not to survive. Each page was a reminder that history often turns on fear, on the decision to act because the alternative seems worse. The United States had feared a battle that might destroy civilization, and in avoiding it, had discovered a weapon that could destroy the world. In later decades, as nuclear arsenals multiplied, the logic of 1945 returned in new forms. Nations prepared for wars they could never fight, stockpiling deterrence as a substitute for trust. Diplomats spoke of balance, poets spoke of shadows. The image of Hiroshima became the moral horizon of the modern age, a warning that knowledge without restraint is merely a slower kind of destruction. For Japan, remembrance became a national duty. Museums rose where ruins had stood. Survivors told their stories to children who could no longer imagine such fire. Each generation translated the past anew, finding in it not only grief, but a fragile kind of hope, the belief that understanding fear is the beginning of peace. For America, the lesson was more elusive. The country that had once feared invading Japan learned instead to fear its own capacity for force. The legacy of 1945 lay not in triumph, but in restraint, in the uneasy conviction that the ultimate victory is the one never fought. As the century turned and the veterans dwindled, the documents of that time gathered dust in archives. Yet the questions they contain remain as immediate as ever. What do nations fear most, the loss of life or the loss of power? What justifies the unthinkable? And can any victory erase the memory of what might have been? The Pacific today is calm, its waters reflecting cities rebuilt from ruin. Airplanes cross the skies where fleets once fought, Tourists walk the beaches that were once invasion sites. The world forgets easily, yet the earth remembers the faint radiation in the soil, the rusting shipwrecks below, the bones still buried beneath coral. Each is a silent witness to the moment when fear itself became history's final weapon. The story ends not with explosion, but with endurance. Out of fire and terror came a peace sustained by vigilance, by the memory of what fear once demanded. The United States never invaded Japan, and Japan never again waged war. Between them stretched an invisible understanding born of shared catastrophe. That survival in the nuclear age would depend not on courage or conquest, but on restraint. And so the chronicle closes where it began, in uncertainty. The Pacific still gleams with light, though now it is the light of cities, not of burning islands. The voices of that generation fade, yet their choices continue to shape the boundaries of the possible. What the United States feared before invading Japan was not merely the cost of war, but the revelation that some victories destroy the victor. In fearing that truth, they glimpsed the edge of humanity's future and, for a moment, stepped back.